everyone. I'm Robin Mansell. I'm a professor emerita at the London School of Economics with a specialism in digital governance. Welcome to all of our speakers and to our online participants to this seminar on navigating geopolitics in AI governance implementation. I am very honored and pleased to chair the first panel in this webinar on behalf of the Oxford Global Society, which is on understanding the landscape, geopolitical influences on AI governance. There will be, for those of you who are online, a second panel that starts at about 2:35 UK time. And it will be chaired by Claire Milton, who's also with us, an independent consultant, and it will focus on cooperation amongst different countries despite the geopolitical tensions in this field of AI governance. A short version of what we're on about today is really how did geopolitics impact on transition from AI principles to the practice of governance and regulation, and what accounts for any gaps that there are between the principles, the ethical goals, and the actual practice, and what are the consequences for competition or cooperation or the safety of AI applications, and more issues for countries, but importantly also for citizen users and also for corporate strategy. So my plan is to very briefly introduce our four panelists who we have with us now, and then I will call upon each of them to say a little bit more about themselves and also to address the topics for this panel for about 5 to 8 minutes each. And then we will have cross-panel discussion and answer Q&A from the audience. For the online audience, please do use the Q&A. I will try to feed in questions, and I believe our speakers are also able to see the Q&A. So let me welcome first Professor Angela Zhang, who is Associate Professor, Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong. Second, Professor Robert Trager, who is co-director of the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative at the University of Oxford Blavatnik School of Government. Dr. Hasselbalch, who is co-founder and director of research at the think tank DataEthics and senior key expert on AI ethics and research, lead on the AI initiative of InTouchAI.eu. And then finally, Professor Milton Mueller, who is professor at the School of Public Policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology. As I said, please elaborate on your backgrounds and your interest in this area when it comes to your turn to speak. And we really look forward to having a good and vigorous discussion. So without more from me, let us start with Angela. Would you like to go ahead, please?
Yes, thank you, Robin, for the very kind introductions. My name is Angela Zhang. I am a professor from the University of Hong Kong, and I specialize in Chinese tech regulation. And in the past couple of years, I've written 2 books. So my first book, let me do some shameless promotion. So here's my first book, Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism, was published about 3 years ago. And it focuses on how China regulates its antitrust law, and as well as how China has been regulated as a target for antitrust regulation in the EU and the United States. And as you may know, in the past few years, the Chinese government underwent a massive crackdown in its tech sector, and antitrust law was featured quite prominently in this crackdown. So the book got quite a lot of attention. So I have another book coming out in April this year called High Wire, How China Regulates Big Tech and Govern Its Economy. And this book takes a much in-depth look in Chinese platform regulations, looking at both antitrust data and labor regulation, but as well as looking at how Chinese online platforms self-regulates. And we also peek into the future and trying to provide some prediction as to how China will govern its tech sector in the future. And I will put a particular emphasis on Chinese regulation of generative AI, because now everybody's focus is on AI these days, especially in the past year. And like all experts on tech regulations, now my current research focus has switched to AI regulation, because the Chinese government is very, very active in this sphere. It had, in the past few years, it had promulgated a number of laws. China was the first to introduce a body of law to comprehensive legislation to regulate algorithm. China was also the first to introduce regulation to regulate deepfake. China is also the first to introduce law to regulate generative AI. So it already have interim measures to regulate generative AI in July this year. So the Chinese government seems very active. And in fact, there's a lot of commentators expressing concern that the Chinese government's approach, very strict and proactive approach, might stifle innovation and undermine the growth of its sector, its tech sector in this area. I actually disagree. I was one of the first few who stood out very early back in April when China promulgated a very early draft of its interim measure, seemingly very strict and very broad. And I was the field that predict that they're going to water this down, and because it's not going to work. And it will go against the government's broader objective to promote growth in this area, particularly against the broader geopolitical environment of the U.S.-China tech rivalry. And we see that the government indeed, significantly watered down the law when the law was finally introduced in July this year. And so far, in fact, 2 weeks after the law was promulgated, we already have 8 companies that received green lights to go ahead with getting license to introduce this technology to the market. And as of now, over 100 companies have received license to introduce generative AI services. So we will talk more later in the discussion, but my overall the overall theme of my remarks today will focus on explaining, why Chinese regulation is more lax than it seems, and in fact, may give the Chinese firms a competitive edge over the European and American counterparts. And I actually have a new paper coming out called "The Promise and Perils of Chinese AI Regulation," which will be available in a couple of weeks. And a lot of what I said today is actually based on that paper. And I look forward to more discussion with the other panelists here.
Okay, thank you so much. Can we turn now to Robert?
Yes, thanks so much. Happy to be here. I'm Robert Trager. I direct something called the AI Governance Initiative at the University of Oxford. So I guess I'll just say a little bit about how I see things in terms of the international governance landscape and the geopolitics of it. So we had the AI Safety Summit in the UK. That happened a couple of months ago now. And we have a couple of other similar summits coming up, one online, but hosted by the government of South Korea, and the other hosted by France. And those summits are interesting, and I think in what they say about the current state of affairs. So, beforehand, many people were critical of the UK summit. I think after the fact, somewhat fewer people were critical. A lot of people thought, well, it maybe went better than I expected it to go. I was a little bit in that camp. It did some useful things, I think, in terms of establishing a little bit more commonality in the space than had existed previously. But another way of looking at it is to say, and this I think applies more broadly in the space, that there was a sort of a consensus there in the summit that some global rules were required, that some forms of governance were really needed, that there was some gap here. And so that was a consensus. On the other hand, what should those rules be? How should we have an international architecture that really instantiates those rules? There wasn't really discussion of that. And this exact step, moving from principle to practice, is where we are, and it's where we have seen international governance discussions founder in the past. When we think about, for instance, the environmental area, for a long time, the principle has been clear. There have been many statements of principle, but actually, what does it mean? What are actors going to do? That has been much more difficult to agree on. And I think we're just entering that similar stage. We've seen statements of principle from just a huge range of actors, from the OECD and UNESCO and the G7 and the UN and national governments and others. Just a huge number of statements of principle that have a lot in common with each other. But what does it mean, and what are we going to do, and how are we going to develop institutions that influence governance in the world? I think that has been less clear. And maybe it's helpful to think about the case of lethal autonomous weapons, which has been discussed now, depending on how you count, for over a decade in the context of the UN and the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons there. And it's an area where the advocates of governance, and we might use the term regulation, have wanted to bring this technology under international law, wanted the extension of international law, and it hasn't occurred. So I think, we have many examples of just a lot of discussion happening in international fora without producing the sort of results. It's very easy to have lots of effort, lots of discussion without actually producing the hoped for results. And I think that's something that we need to think about in this area. Now I'm conscious, I'm not sure how much time I should be taking or have taken, so I don't want to say much more, but so maybe I'll just end with I think two questions that we really need to be thinking about as we consider these issues. And the first is really the question of what areas of governance should be internationalized, because in many spaces, for instance, privacy regulation, Europe and the United States, and certainly other jurisdictions, have taken different approaches to that. And probably they're not and shouldn't agree, because those different approaches represent different national values, and that's a good thing. And so in many areas, probably autonomy should be preserved, and we shouldn't actually have international governance. But in some areas, probably national regulation can't be effective without international governance. And so I think we need to identify those areas and identify the areas of consensus internationally where we really want to have international governance. And as we do that, we need to figure out, and this is the second question, how can we actually move from principle to practice? So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to turn next to Gree. Would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this really interesting debate and with these esteemed panelists. Basically, I wear many hats, but I think that what is most important for this conversation is to mention that I spent around 2 decades working directly with global tech governance. So in particular with the EU's approach to data and AI governance and ethics in general. So One of the things that I did was that I was part of the EU's high-level group established in 2018 by the European Commission, and we developed what we could say the ethical foundation of the EU's AI strategy and also the AI Act with these 7 ethical requirements, for example. And so continuing after that, I've also been working with, and I am currently, as you also mentioned, the key expert and research lead of what's called the EU's International Outreach for a Human-Centric Approach to AI, in short, InTouchAI. And this is a large foreign policy project launched in 2020 by the European Commission, Service for Foreign Policy instrument, and also the European Commission in general, the DG Connect, to engage with international partners and promote EU's approach to trustworthy AI at a global level. Now, research-wise, because this is relevant also in terms of I've been kind of with my more academic work and the books that I've been writing, I've also been exploring kind of the development of the global field and also moving from more regional approaches to more international approaches. And so from my point of view, what I've been most interested in this is this kind of negotiation of values and ethics and the power dynamics in the context of not only AI, but data, big data governance in general. So, for example, in my first book from 2016, I was actually with my co-author, we were looking, in fact, at data ethics as a competitive advantage. And particularly, we looked at the EU, and this was around when there was also this ecosystems of companies and organizations and scientists emerging around this, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation that was adopted around that time. And actually, the conversation back then was also, does regulation stifle innovation? But what we did was actually also looking at it as a competitive advantage for the EU. Now, in my last book, Data Ethics of Power from 2021, I looked more specifically at data and AI ethics as a cultural positioning in global tech policies, and in this, more importantly, looking at it from the EU's positioning. And so now moving, and it makes sense in a little bit because it's relevant in terms of my own the things that I've been exploring in my books. Is now in my latest book I'm looking at human power. So looking at our own self-perception as humans and humanity in the context of these more global discourses on what is technological power, not only AI power, but technological power in general. And this is relevant for this discussion because what I think I've seen, and many of us have seen over the last 2 decades in this global field, is of course this kind of negotiation of narratives and increasingly global positioning of power actors like the EU, but also other kinds of interests and stakeholders, moving from what one could maybe call this more raw focus on interoperability, like technical interoperability, the protection of rights, access, security, and safety, to this more existential discussions that we have at the moment, where we have this emphasis on humanity and what does it mean to be human. Particularly, we've seen it now with maybe I don't know if I can call it AI hype. Maybe sometimes I think it's relevant to call it that has moved into this more public debate. So what I think for this moment right now that is relevant to discuss is to look at that there are actually really different approaches to AI and data, and they're competing right now at regional and at a global level to gain this technological momentum. If we think of in terms of kind of what Thomas P. Hughes, for example, the historian, called this. And this is where we see, I think, what I've seen moving to now is moving from this idea of local systems, and now we're thinking about more integrated global systems. And in fact, it's basically a competition between different technological systems, different styles of scientists, entrepreneurs, requirements, expectations from users, investors, lawmakers from different regions. And of course, what we have to be really aware of when we're having this conversation is the power dynamics. So we have to understand what kind of power we enforce in the geopolitics of these very often very data-intensive socio-technical infrastructures. Is it democratic powers? Is it monopolistic powers, totalitarian powers? Because this is, of course, what we're doing when we're having these conversations. And from that point of view, of course, I think from the point of view that I have from the EU position is that, of course, I think that the EU has a really strong position in the global AI agenda. And of course, this position wasn't developed recently. It was developed over the last 10 years. It started with this very tough stance on data protection and the GDPR. So in that position, the EU as a really what it was referred to in the beginning as a regulatory superpower. And then moving on to this more the ethics work, the ethics foundation of the EU high-level group, then more in terms of the more regulatory. We talk a lot about the AI Act at the moment, but we also have to think about the Digital Service and the Digital Market Act, challenging the big platforms. The Data Governance Act, which is basically developed to create a more sovereign EU data sharing infrastructure. And then, of course, in the end, the risk-based regulatory approach of the AI Act, which probably everyone knows here that it reached a political agreement between the Council and the Parliament just before Christmas. Just to finish up, I think so these are some of the regulatory initiatives, but I think if we think about in terms of governance in general, and this was mentioned before, of course, also, I think that what is most important, and this is something that the EU has been doing for the last couple of years, and this is also part of the work that I'm doing for the InTouchAI project, is that the EU is, of course, working more directly on creating alliances globally with what is referred to as the like-minded partners and then we go back to the question of humanity and the existence of human beings. What does it mean to be human? But it's more human-centric standard for trustworthy AI. And I really think that it's really important to leverage on, again, probably repeating what was said just before, on these emerging but also really already existing multilateral and bilateral initiatives within the more international forums. So I'm thinking about the G7, the GPI, the Global Digital Compact. And also one thing that I'm personally very involved in is this the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, where we develop, at least I'm on the EU side, developing as one of the small group of experts, an EU or US working group, developing the EU and US joint roadmap for AI risk assessment. And we just published last year a joint terminology, and this is really relevant, with shared definitions between the EU and US of 63 AI terms. And one of them was actually human-centric AI. So that's also relevant to look at. So just emphasizing this idea that we need more of these spaces of negotiation, more joint initiatives, more dialogues, more diplomacy to facilitate this convergence of regulatory approaches, but also to create legal certainty and solve some of the conflicts that we sometimes see between the different approaches to AI in particular. So I think we can have a conversation more in depth after this.
Thank you very much indeed. We turn now to Milton. Would you like to go ahead?
Hi, I'm Milton Mueller. I'm at Georgia Tech in the US, in Atlanta. And I'm with the Internet Governance Project, as you can see from my background. And that's the framework in which I have participated in global governance debates regarding the digital economy for some time. And that gives me a unique perspective because, internet governance has always been perceived as something that is global in nature. And through ICANN, we established what is actually a private sector-based, actually global and not national or international form of governance. And as I say, that gives me a unique perspective on AI because I'm going to sound a sour note here, but I think it's a mistake to frame this whole discussion as being about AI or the governance of AI or even the geopolitics of AI. because AI, as the popular discussion has it, does not really exist, or at least it's a mislabeling. So what we call AI is simply the latest manifestation of computing. That is to say, it's the latest development of increasingly powerful information processing capabilities, increasingly sophisticated software applications, faster networks, and larger stores of digital data. So I call this complex of functionalities the digital ecosystem. And therefore, it is no coincidence that the flurry of debate over AI or AI regulation is also leading to debates about the governance of data, the governance of the cloud, trade in semiconductors, and even content moderation in social media. So what we sometimes call AI governance basically comes down to the governance of computing, which means cybersecurity governance, data governance, internet governance, the definition of property rights in software and data, the governance of trade and ICT devices, including chips, and the regulation of platforms. So all of the geopolitical implications of AI, and that's actually what I want to focus on the most, is the geopolitical aspect. All of these geopolitical implications are byproducts of a world knitted together by a globalized digital ecosystem. And the problematique, if you will, of regulation and governance is now coming from the mostly reactionary attempts by governments, national governments, to shore up their powers and privileges as the globalized ecosystem develops. Unfortunately, as these issues become geopolitical, there's a tendency by nation states to abandon the globalized regime of free trade, free markets, and a borderless internet, and attempt to achieve power advantages by deglobalizing and pursuing what I'm calling digital neo-mercantilism. And that leads not only to disruptive and fragmentary attempts to control the entire digital infrastructure, it also leads to restrictions on capital investment, to censorship, and what some scholars have called the weaponization of interdependence. And I think you can talk mainly about three power blocks here. One centered in the US, one in China, and one in Europe. I think Europe's pursuit of digital sovereignty is really what's behind most of what's happening now. I think the GDPR was slightly different. There was a sincere attempt to protect individual rights in that legislation. But since then, we've had this movement towards digital sovereignty in Europe, which is leading to some very, I think, destructive and deglobalizing attempts, such as the NIS2, Europe's attempt to seize control of certain forms of domain name system regulation, the EIDAS, which is another attempt to essentially destroy the globalized system of web PKI. The Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act are more typical attempts to regulate platforms, but they also have massive implications for the way content is regulated and the way AI is regulated. And the AI Act is kind of, in my opinion, somewhat comical attempt to assert that they can classify the risks of AI applications before they have even been developed or implemented, and stuff things into categories. It's an example of ex-ante regulation, which is bound to be ineffective and to fail. The US is not much better. Of course, we know that it is now the major disruptive force in undermining globalized digital ecosystem, mainly through its fear of China. And of course, China has always been extremely nationalistic and protectionist in its approach to regulation. Of course, it has an interest in keeping export markets open, in which sense it is somewhat progressive, but it is also extremely repressive and regressive in its domestic policies regarding the digital ecosystem. So I think, again, I would like to focus the discussion more on the way so-called AI regulation impacts the digital ecosystem as a whole, and the geopolitics of that. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Milton. That's a rich set of opening remarks for sure. I think I really would like to encourage you as you respond and talk to each other to remember that we are as interested in this case about what maybe, how shall I put it, what countries could or should do, as well as in terms of principle, as well as how they implement it, coming back to the question of institutionalization at what level, whether national or global. And we've had comments that emphasize both the institution building side of things, the power dynamic side of things. I had that interesting comments about how China is being one of the first to introduce particular pieces of legislation in this space, and then walking back from that for a variety of reasons. And it seems to me that it is right to say that AI is defined in numerous ways, but it is very much about the wider digital ecology. So maybe I can encourage each of you as you come back to say something a little bit more about what you think are the points of difference or conflict. Conflict was mentioned once or twice. What do you think are the points of difference? Why is it at this particular moment in time, while there is a great deal of hype and excitement around something we define as AI, what is it that prevents countries or companies from being able to reach agreement on what should be done in practice at a global level? This obviously is geopolitical, but how do we break down what is the geopolitical set of issues that are really so contentious in this area? And maybe you can respond to that as you come back. And perhaps if we go in the same order as before, just for now, I come to Angela first, and then, but any of you can raise your hand at any time. Angela.
Right. I mean, I really enjoy listening to the remarks of my fellow panelists. I was actually quite inspired by some of the remarks, and I'm going to respond to that. But before that, to come back to Robin's questions about the commonalities and the differences among the major superpowers like EU, China, and the United States, I actually would divide US and China in the camp of more pro-growth, whereas EU is more emphasis on human rights protection, so it's a more serious regulator here. And I don't think definitely geopolitical tensions play a prominent role in shaping what we see here. But I also want to highlight an additional factor, which is the institutional settings that we are observing in these three different regimes. And China is a authoritarian government, a very strong state capacity, right? I mean, the government is able to quickly mobilize its legal institutions to do things very quickly, and also can decide not to do things, you know. And the government is insecure about, you know, how AI might generate content that is misaligned with its political agenda. So, which is why one of the very important reasons why China has been very proactive in regulating in this space. But as an authoritarian government, they also have other utility, right? I mean, they need to enhance economic growth. They need to catch up with the U.S. in AI technology. So that which also explain why we are seeing what we are seeing today, that the government is actually enabling this technology with its regulation. And on the other hand, U.S. has a completely different type of institution. You know, we have a federal system in the U.S. And great checks and balance, right? I mean, we saw the Biden administration introduce a sweeping executive order back in October. But even the president can only do that much, right? I mean, executive order have a lot of limitation. It's not same as the type of law that will be promulgated by Congress, right? I mean, it's subject to a lot of limitations. So when you look closer at the executive order, although it's trying to achieve a lot of things, but the only and the major mandatory obligations on firms is mostly this kind of disclosure requirement, and that they need to disclose the safety results and for frontier AI models, and also they need to monitor and disclose foreign clients that have the capacity to produce and use AI models that can can be used for malicious cyber activities, right? I mean, so very minimal touch on the firms. Mostly is enabling, like kind of directing the government authorities to do things. And we need to pay attention to these differences in institutional setting. And by the way, the US is a very litigious country. So despite the fact that we're not seeing the government is doing a lot, the plaintiff's bar is doing a lot, right? I mean, we see just the last couple of weeks, New York Times have launched a very high-profile litigation, and just last Friday, there's another class action suit against these big AI firms. And if you count, there are at least 13 big litigations ongoing in the United States, and all these things will add, burdened to the AI firms, big or large, doing business in the U.S. When you look across in Europe, right? I mean, Europe is the most serious regulator here. And I would think that one of the most important reasons why EU is so committed to regulating AI has to do with the fact that it has a very strong and powerful and independent international organization like the EU that is very seriously committed to regulation, where it doesn't need to bear a lot of the burdens like national government, right? I mean, an EU institution does not need to worry that much of the geopolitical tensions as a national government does. And it's more, fixating its attention to regulation itself. And I think that is one of the most important reasons why we see EU, has very strong policy, has very proactive policy entrepreneurs that are actively promoting, these regulations. And I think the institutional settings matter hugely here, in addition to the geopolitical tensions. And I also want to respond briefly to what Robert just mentioned. Yeah, he makes some interesting remark regarding international cooperation. I'm actually not, I actually really appreciate what he mentioned about the key questions here. I definitely agree with him. But before we move on to the point of, what are the things that, we should, what type of governance should be internationalized, before even we move on to that, I think there's a bigger question here is that, should we get China to the table of international cooperation? Because before the UK summit, China is basically excluded in most of the important international organizations, right? Except for the UN, China was very active there, but China wasn't a big part of the big negotiation with the most advanced AI countries. But China is a major power in AI. And to be honest, I mean, so far what we have seen, despite the fact that you see a lot of international organizations doing a lot of things, they're not, the stuff that they have achieved has been very vague. I mean, as what you pointed out, but you frame it in a more diplomatic way. I mean, it's focused more on principles, but, in practice, we see it's quite vague. I mean, when it comes to implementations, how much impact it has on practice, it seems very limited. And without having China onto the table, and without the US and China at the table, which I think is the single most important factor in international organization, I just don't see international cooperation can go anywhere. So I'll stop here first.
Okay, thank you. I hear you about the importance of institutional differences and contexts. We do need to keep that in mind. Robert, do you want to go ahead next? Because there was a kind of a question addressed to you, so maybe you'd like to respond.
I'm happy to respond to that, or maybe should I respond also to your question for us all? Okay. Yeah, well, yeah. So what's preventing cooperation? I think the different interests of the countries, and those being determined by their different positions in terms of development of the technology is a big part of it. Um, and I think we can really see that in some places where it does look like when their ability to develop the technology changes, then their political positions seem to change a little bit alongside them. And maybe I don't want to be undiplomatic in saying where that's most clear, but I think probably you can think of some recent examples of that, maybe in the context of the EU AI Act negotiations. And I think there's sort of the proliferation concerns that some of the advanced states have that mean that some forms of international governance wouldn't look very sensible to them. So if you had an international organization like the IAEA, for instance, which was going into not all countries, but some countries and looking at what they're doing, that's a very good way to find out what countries are doing, and so raises proliferation concerns depending on which countries are involved or at the pointy end of involvement, if you will. And then there's a second aspect, which is simply the sort of race to the bottom, I guess, or race in the direction of the bottom, perhaps, where many countries are worried about inhibiting innovation. And inhibiting innovation mean that worry means that they don't want to see the sorts of regulation that would maybe prohibit them from taking certain steps, and maybe they're worried about being able to implement some forms of regulation, and that's been a very significant worry for many countries. On the other hand, we see all these AI safety institutes that are springing up now, and I think maybe slightly in contrast to something to one thing that was said is I do think it's true that the EU has been in some ways a much more active regulator. On the other hand, when it comes to what now goes by the name of AI safety, which I'm not sure is really a great term for it, but in thinking about these so-called safety issues, there it really does seem to be the US and China more than any other countries, at least so far, that have focused on those, even though we do see these safety institutes kind of replicating almost through mitosis. And Japan now saying that it will build one, and South Korea talking about it, and Kenya saying that it's considering it, and others. So that's been interesting to watch. So maybe this last question about China and the US and China being excluded from some fora. I do think that we'll get simultaneous processes. And in a way, it's a good thing if we have simultaneous processes where there is a group of states in one area, or maybe a group of states in another area that have simultaneous processes, and then maybe some really internationalized forum. I agree absolutely that the exclusion of China in some cases has been a problem, given China's very important role in developing the technology, both on the research side and also in terms of actual implementation. And I agree with the previous speaker, Professor Zhang, that I think we can look back to some other instances of significant forms of cooperation over technology, something like the Non-Proliferation Agreement, which really had its birth in bilateral discussions. It was bilateral discussions between the US and the Soviet Union that then had to be broadened out to include everyone else in the world, but it was really those bilateral discussions that initiated that. Or in the case of the Financial Action Task Force, it was really the discussions between France and the United States that initiated that process that was then broadened out first to the G7, then to 16 countries, and now includes, in some fashion, most of the countries in the world. So I do have a lot of hope that perhaps the US and China, potentially along with some others, might be able to start something which then is broadened out to include many others. But of course, I mean, we have both the challenge of practical action, which sometimes is easier in smaller groups, and the challenge of real voice and influence for all the different communities that are affected, which implies larger groups. And so I think we need to strike some balances there, and we have our work cut out for us. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I thought we'd come to Milton next and then Gree. The reason I'm doing it in that order is because I think Gree may bring some insight into the EU, and a number of comments have been made, and also to the human-centric side of this. Milton.
Well, I was amused to hear Robert talk about the US and China getting together to start something. I think as the only American on the panel here, I may be the only one aware of how deep and significant the rift between the US and China is. And so to answer Robin's question directly, what is the source of the conflict? To my mind, the source of the conflict is essentially a contest over kind of world hegemony. The U.S. sees itself, as very used to being the global hegemon in terms of having the dominant power worldwide, and particularly in the information technology sector. And it feels extremely threatened by the China's rise as a economic success, right? And to me, as a liberal, it's very disappointing to see the U.S. lose confidence in its ability to compete, which it is really still by far the leader in all of these areas. But it seems to be losing confidence in its ability to compete, and it's moving towards protectionism. And this is not just Donald Trump and the nationalist populist Republicans, it's the Biden administration and the progressives who want to have a more protectionist, sheltered, and industrial policy approach towards the digital ecosystem. So the US believes that it needs to suppress the ability of China to participate in the digital ecosystem as a peer competitor. And that is the main source of the conflict. Now, it draws in other power blocks around the world. It's moving or trying to move towards a plurilateral system of alliances with the EU and the Quad. So it cultivates India, it cultivates Australia and the other Southeast Asian countries, Korea and Japan, as kind of a bloc that it can lead to resist some of the industrial incursions of China. And for the EU, it's all about American hegemony, because the EU is motivated primarily by the need to suppress the economic success of American digital platforms. So the EU is essentially, with all of its regulations, who are they regulating? Essentially, they're regulating American firms. And the fact that they are American is a political bonus, because it makes it very easy for the EU to come up with these regulations. Again, I want to emphasize how serious this problem is from the US side. We have a string of executive orders that span the Trump and Biden administrations that are essentially saying that any form of information technology, any form, whether it's hardware or software or applications, that is owned by an adversary nation or has any ownership by an adversary nation, or is developed or under the control of a firm in an adversary nation, is a national security threat. and we are using the international economic emergency powers to develop these executive orders. We're talking about banning applications. This is the land of the First Amendment. We're talking about banning applications, software applications, media outlets like TikTok. And this is all politically motivated by the feeling that China is a threat. Now, China is not helping its cause because it acts, in my opinion, very stupidly many times to reinforce these concepts of threat. Its approach towards, dissidents, the extraterritorial reach of the national security law in Hong Kong is designed to intimidate people wherever they are. They have police forces in New York that are tracking down dissidents outside of their territory. And they, engaged in a number of cyber attacks against the United States. So the whole AI debate in some ways is framed within this context of military and political competition between the US and what it perceives as a threat to its hegemony. We'll stop there.
Right. There's a lot in what you said there. Green, would you like to come back on these points?
Yes, there's a lot, and there's been a lot throughout the debate that I wanted to. So let me see if I've been taking a lot of notes. I think I wanted to start by a little bit addressing this idea of the kind of the global cyber digital infrastructure that is being, I guess, as I heard, challenged by different regulatory approaches and protective and so focusing on sovereignty and things like this. I think that I would rather turn it around and say that we, of course, these original ideas about the internet as being this big global infrastructure, technically it's true that somehow we got closer and we are living in this global community and everything now. But what we've seen and what has been kind of intensifying is this kind of concentration of power. So basically what we have is not really a global technical infrastructure. Well, we do have a global technical infrastructure, but in terms of the concentration of power, then I would rather see, and that's also from the EU perspective, the way I see the AI strategy, the general data protection, the Digital Market Act, the Digital Service Act, is of course it is about economy, but it's basically also, you could say, it's using regulation as a kind of antidote to the concentration of power that we've seen increasingly. So what we have now is, of course, and I think anyone agrees on that, when we look at the global cyber internet infrastructure, we have huge global inequalities in terms of, and here, yes, it is a very particular business environment, which is American, it is US based, it is Silicon Valley that has been developing most of the big platforms and are the big platforms that we're dealing with now. But for example, if you look at in terms of the global South, most of these developments and the developers that are dealing with AI or that are developing the core infrastructure of their communities are dependent on very big actors that are certainly not part of a kind of decentralized infrastructure. So that's the first point I would like to say. In terms of commonalities, you were asking about commonalities and challenges in this. So what I see as kind of the core challenge is, of course, this that we have this idea of this globalized internet and the globalized infrastructure, but in reality, when we look at it, it's very concentrated. Who is developing the keynotes of the internet infrastructure? Who has the governing powers? Who has the governing institution? Who is it who's actually able and capable of developing the core component of this infrastructure? And importantly, which values are imposed. So if we take the term like AI, for example, this is the very idea that we have, and I totally agree with this idea that AI is only the last the top of the digitalization development. But if we look at how it's been discussed in the discourses around AI, both when we talk about regulation, governance, but also the public debate, then it's a very, very particular framework around what is AI. So AI is understood as this kind of almost this imitation of human power. And this does also come out of a very particular approach to how we build this kind of technologies. Again, we have this idea that we can replace humans, that we can replace different capabilities, we can replace the workforce, and so on and so forth. And that is also a form of concentration of power, again. So when we think of what we could actually gather around in terms of, and that's what I see very much in both the bilateral and the multilateral different governance approaches to AI, is this, as and you mentioned it, the human-centric approach to AI as a challenge to this form of concentration of power. So what I see is increasingly gathering around a shared value-based approach. And when I say value-based approach, it's very much based on this idea of having shared principles and ethics rather than having a shared technical infrastructure and having this interoperability. And so we've seen over the last couple of years several principles, and Robert was talking about moving from principles to practice. But I actually think that we're still at the point where we still need to negotiate some of these value-based approaches. And that's where we can find the commonalities. I actually believe that the different regulatory approaches is an asset. I don't think it's a challenge. I think it's an asset, and it's an asset to actually start having these decentralized approaches globally to the internet, rather than having you could almost call it a fake global internet, because I don't believe that it actually is a global internet. So many of these approaches that we have are actually positive in terms of having starting to move towards some kind of commonalities in terms of values, but not necessarily in terms of having exactly the same regulatory approaches or one big institution. So I don't know if I answered all. There were so many questions into this, but maybe we can have a conversation about that. Those were some of the notes that I had.
Thank you very much. It seems to me that the reason why the questions we're asking are so difficult to answer in one sense is because we're talking about a multi-level problem. And the complexity of the problem is such that in one sense, we have many of the continuities of the past bedeviling approaches to what we call AI. One of the continuities is asymmetries of power between different governments and corporate entities around the world. And whenever you have those asymmetries, of course, you're going to have conflict. And what we try to do in the various regions, Europe, US, China, is put some guardrails in place in the hope, if you like, that they will have an impact. And in some cases, they surely will have some impact. But I think what is really interesting in this area, particularly because of all the hype around technology, is the fragility of most of the actors. So we know that the big players in the different regions will make their way. AI services are being implemented as we speak. There will be attempts to shape which ones are most widely diffused and what consequences they have for people. But the issue which governance raises always, and it's been mentioned, is accountability. Who is accountable to whom, and how will that change over time as we go forward? So maybe as you come back and intervene again on the different points that you've heard, you could kind of focus a little bit on this question of accountability, which is also one of the ones in the Q&A, that questions are being asked about what happens when new measures are taken, whether at the global level or at regional country level. how realistic is it to expect that actors will be held to account? And so perhaps you can speak from whatever perspective you like to that point. Who would like to go first? I will call upon you. Okay, Robert?
Sure. I'm happy to answer that one. Yeah, I saw that question, which is an essential one in the Q&A. I think, if we look at the model from some other industries, I think it's instructive to us. So, for instance, the question I think asked if there's any research that showed that an international governing ecosystem can be effective, and I think that they certainly appear to be in some other industries. If we think about, for instance, the Financial Action Task Force and the money laundering area, there's work by Julia Morse. What's it called? The Banker's Blacklist is the book that I can recommend to you. And that's looking at sort of how we create a model that's, I think, an interesting one, because there, what you have is the auditing of jurisdictions by an international group to be sure that jurisdictions have appropriate regulations themselves. So it isn't that you have an international body that's auditing firms. And we have that in some other areas like ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, or the International Maritime Organization. So ICAO doesn't audit, British Airways or American Airlines. It audits the aviation ecosystems of Britain and America, and indeed everyone else. And that seems to have created really quite extraordinary improvements in safety provision around the world in those industries. And I think we can have maybe some similar things in the AI area. I don't want to go on too long here, so I'll mention that we have a paper on exactly this topic, which you can find on our website. But I think there's also research consistent with this, that a tie to the trade regime on the part of international agreements is something that really aids with enforcement. And then I think maybe just a last point, if for those of you who are thinking about this, is thinking about whether you really want to be distinguishing between civilian regulation and regulation of military sectors, because the ones that I was mentioning are really about civilian regulation. And the sort of arms control frame, I think, is also important and involves many different considerations that are obviously fraught and separate from the civilian area considerations. Maybe I just want to mention one other quick thing in response to one of the other panelists, which was that, there's a saying about revolutions that they look impossible beforehand and inevitable after the fact. And I think that applies a little bit to international agreements as well, because yes, it can look like it would be very difficult to have some form of agreement, any form of agreement between, let's say, the United States and China. But on the other hand, we saw agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union in the depths of the Cold War. So I also think that even some things that may appear to be challenging turn out to be possible in the end. I think these are things that are certainly worth considering.
Thank you. I see two hands up now. I'm not sure who's came first. I'll turn to Angela first, and then Milton.
Actually, Milton's hands was first.
Was it? Okay.
Sure. Let me address. I think Robert raised an interesting point about the international air regulation, and I think that dovetails into a point that I think that Gru made that is incorrect. She said that this globalization is fake, and I'm sorry, that's just technically completely wrong. The globalization, TCP/IP is the standard. Okay, that's the data protocol that everybody uses around the world. It doesn't matter whether you're a communist party. It doesn't matter whether you are the Indian nationalist government. Everybody is using that standard, and it is globally compatible. The domain name system root is globally compatible. The various networks are all interconnected. This is not a fake globalization. This is the most serious form of globalization the world has ever seen. Now, what she was saying was that maybe we want different values to be injected into that global infrastructure through various forms of regulation. And that's indeed is the fundamental conflict, is that if there is a contradiction between the idea of jurisdictional regulation and this globalized technical infrastructure, and we've been dealing with that from the beginning. So going back to the air traffic thing, when the internet was first sort of exploding onto the scene, we created a form of governance that was deliberately global. We made it global in order to avoid jurisdictional fragmentation of the internet. It's called ICANN. It sort of consolidates the coordination of the domain name system and the IP addressing system. And in order to get out of the territorial fragmentation of nation states, we made it a private sector organization. And I suspect that SWIFT, and I'm not sure about ICAO, that may be more national based, but I don't know if it's a UN-based treaty organization. I don't think it is. But that's the point, is in an industry sector, if you want to do governance, you have to have a point of leverage that is grounded in the nature of the technical infrastructure. And so, for example, when we're talking about how do we want to govern the domain name system, we're saying, well, there's a root, and whatever gets into the root is a point of collective coordination, a point of collective governance, and that's going to be the foundation of the way we govern the domain name system. Now, one of the things that bothers me about the way people talk about AI governance is, where is this point of leverage? It doesn't exist, right? There is no such thing, because AI is essentially software, or it's some kind of functionality derived from a broader digital ecosystem. So if you're going to tell me I'm going to have global governance of AI, you tell me what's your point of leverage? How are you going to control what software people write, what data they access to do machine learning? Tell me about how that's going to happen without establishing some imaginary but scarily authoritarian system of poking into the whole way we use information technology. I just don't see anything like that happening. I can see, in terms of accountability, that people can be responsible for bad things that happen when they use AI applications. And in fact, many of that is already in place. If you're talking about medical AI applications, they already go through FDA forms of approval. So you're regulating the behavior associated with an application. You're not regulating AI. And I think that's the approach you need to take. You have to be very functional and very focused in your approach to this, and you need to be focused on how different interests around the world have a mutual self-interest in coordination, right? In some kind of an equilibrium on coordination.
Okay, thank you. It's a lot of food for thought. I think I really appreciate you introducing, in a way, a distinction between the corporate interests in going forward and innovating and winning the AI race, and people's interests and being held accountable for what they produce in terms of software and its harms, etc. Angela.
Yes, I actually also saw in the Q&A, there was a question directed to me about accountability, which is also related to what has been discussed here. And I think it's indeed a very important point, because when you look across the regulation in these major powers, one key question is like, do they really have teeth? Even including EU's AI Act, for the most part, it's not really an ex-ante type of regulations, to be technically speaking, right? I mean, it doesn't require a license for firms to introduce these products to the market. Instead, it is asking firms to do self-assessment and then register the foundation models with, this large database that will be maintained by the EU institutions. So for the most part, I would see this as a form of kind of coerced self-regulation. And if you don't comply, in the future, when you're subject to audit or something goes wrong, you could be subject to regulations. So, query whether this is going to succeed, because at the end of the day, it's still mostly relying on firm self-assessment. When we go back to very basic econ model of deterrence, right? I mean, you look at how big the fine is, how serious the penalty is, and also you look at how likely any violation will be caught, right? I mean, if you apply that to what EU is doing here, the penalty is indeed huge, but how likely if a firm's non-compliance will be caught, merits, some serious considerations. And when you think about China, right? I mean, China do have its own interim regulation to regulate generative AI, but there's no fines stipulated in the law, right? I mean, and so it has to piggyback on the pre-existing regulation, like China's various data law, like personal information protection law and data security law and etc. Right? I mean, and it also involves a bunch of other things like IP violation, labor violation, blah blah blah. But then we go back to the question of, do they really enforce the law? How likely are they going to go after these firms? And given the current political economy and this context, it's highly unlikely the Chinese government will take a very aggressive stance in going after its own, national champions in producing AI, even if they have done something, so for non-compliance, right? I mean, so again, the audience did raise a very important question here, is that, looking beyond this black letter law, I mean, another very important question that we need to consider here is implementation and how, would they really be held accountable? And the same question can be raised about the U.S. executive order promulgated last October, right? I mean, so even if these firms have been found to disclose, safety tax that reviews dangerous capacity or whatever, but the executive order did not say anything. What would the government do? And the executive order actually lack authority in forcing firms to do something. If it turned out that the disclosure test reviews dangerous, propensity. So, then it's again come back to the question of accountability. Are they really will be held accountable for what they do, right? And so this is my response to the audience question and also to Robin's question. But I also want to come back to what Milton's comments just now about the point of leverage in AI governance. And he seems to think that there's no point of leverage. One question I have for Milton, if we still have the chance to go around another round, is, do you think chips will be a point of leverage here? Because, one of the key criteria for governments right now, whether in the US or EU, now close to have a final AI Act, they are all looking at computing power, because computing power is a proxy to gauge the capacity of the frontier AI model, right? I mean, so whoever have the most, computing power, have the most advanced AI chips, will have the capacity to produce the most advanced and potentially most dangerous AI products here, right? I mean, so could the regulation of chips be the point of leverage? I mean, of course, the U.S. is, stand at the forefront of doing that, and together with a bunch of alliance countries.
I hope I get a chance to answer that question.
Yeah, and then China is trying to independently create its own. Right. I mean, this is something that I think is very important. And then if we have another round, I would love to hear how Milton responds to that.
Okay, thank you. Milton, do you want to come back really quickly just on that point?
Yeah, I will.
Really
so I'll try to make it really quick. She's absolutely right. This is what I've been saying about it's the digital ecosystem, it's not AI. So people are thinking, what is our point of leverage for stopping China from being good at AI? And yes, they are grasping at chips, and they're discovering that that is probably not working because China will develop its own chips, and you can come up with architectures that don't require the absolute fastest chips, but certainly your only point of leverage is to try to control the entire digital ecosystem. So I saw an article by some national security oriented think tank in the US that said, well, we can't really control chips that well, so let's regulate the entire cloud industry. And then you can regulate what chips get into what cloud providers, and then you can control the capacity of the cloud providers. So you see, if you want to regulate something called AI, this diffuse thing, you're going to be reaching for control of the entire digital ecosystem in one way or another, and chips is going to be one victim. Of course, there'll be massive inefficiencies from doing that because all the restrictions you put on chips will not just be restrictions on the Chinese and on their AI applications. They will be systemic in their effect.
Okay, thanks, Cree. You've been waiting patiently.
Yes, thank you. So going a little bit back to the question about accountability, but also, of course, addressing, of course, what I was saying before was, and I think I was emphasizing that, of course, we have a global technical infrastructure, but what we don't have is a global distribution of power in this field, and we don't have a global distribution of opportunities. Basically, what we have a concentration in power, and I'm not talking about the US as a power actor there. I'm actually more talking about a very particular place in the US, Silicon Valley, which is basically a kind of a value-based approach based on the original move fast, break things, which will usually be democratic rules and so on and so forth. And I do think that in this context, regulation, and that's where I come to accountability, is the antidote to this. So, but in the very end, then, right now we have, for example, the Digital Service Act and the Digital Markets Act and Thierry Breton that went to Elon Musk and X to start infringement proceedings regarding the transparency, the how they address illegal content and misinformation and things like this. And in that context, in terms of accountability, if we have to think of where do we want who or what is it that we want to be accountable to? I do think that the EU and even the AI Act, which is basically focusing on uses of AI and not an AI as such, and that also has a fundamental rights impact analysis as part of the regulatory framework, is one of the places where I do think and I do believe that there is some kind of a regulatory framework for accountability in the global field with extra jurisdictional effects. And so that's basically, I think, for accountability, we have had a huge lack of accountability in the global field so far. And this is why we need a different kind of power actor in the global field. And if we can find some kind of alliances between different like-minded partners that have the democratic values, the idea of accountability as part of the legal framework, and the legal framework as where you can go even as a consumer or any interest stakeholder or anything in this field, then I do think that the only approach we have right now, following a long period and several decades where regulation was not the key approach, I think this is the only option we have. So that's basically my comment on accountability right now.
Okay, thank you. Robert.
Okay, 2 quick comments, mostly responding to a couple of things that Milton said, and also some comments of others. So I think ICANN is such an interesting model from internet governance, But I think we need to be a little bit careful when we're emphasizing just how global it is and is perceived to be. We're talking about an entity, after all, that is subject not just to US law, but to California law. It's incorporated in California. It originally had a contract with the US Commerce Department, which was part of its governance. It has a governing board which attempts to represent global interests in a way, but I think it's fair to say that, particularly in its early days and to some degree still continuing, it represents a very particular set of interests, and that's part of the reason why it was so effective at representing that particular set of interests. But it's not to say that it was a consensus, a global consensus, really. No, so I just want to say I think that is very interesting, but I just think we need to be clear-eyed about the both sides of these different examples. I think it's useful, again, when we're thinking about something like accountability in the context of, let's say, the civil aviation sector. What happens when there's a violation of ICAO standards somewhere? Well, one of the things that can happen is that the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration in the US, can deny access to US airspace for any flight originating from a country that's in violation of ICAO standards. And we could, if we wanted, it's somewhat similar in the Financial Action Task Force regime with the black and brown lists. And we could, if we wanted, do somewhat similar things with AI probably. So we could say, for instance, that if there's a jurisdiction that is in violation of standards, some version of international standards, then other jurisdictions could say, well, we're not going to import products from that jurisdiction that violate those standards, and we're not going to export inputs into AI products to those jurisdictions. So that's the kind of thing that we could say. But really, there's a whole range of things. When we think about, let's say, the non-proliferation regime, that's a regime that is a real focus as a pillar of major power foreign policy, and they're using a whole variety of incentives there to make sure that there's a significant degree of compliance around the world. So while most arms control agreements that are signed around the world actually don't work and are violated, some of them that really become a focus of policy can work. So I think, anyway, when we think about, there are some tools. I think we shouldn't sort of give up hope. There are some tools that we could have that maybe wouldn't solve all problems, but they could solve some of the problems that we have when we're trying to regulate this new technology.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting discussion. I hope you all feel that you've had a chance to air your views. It seems to me that we can be guided by both hope and a bit of despair, particularly around contested values and whether there might ever be convergence. We have to end in a couple of seconds, well, actually 2 minutes, because the second panel will start after a 10-minute break. It seems to me that all forms of governance and regulation have consequences, a lot of them unintended. And what we need to imagine, I think, for the future is that certainly some kinds of institutionalization and governance regulation will happen at all levels, no doubt. And a big question is not just which corporate winners will there be and losers, but which communities, especially in the global south, but also in the global north, will be winners and losers. And these things matter, and time will progress. And the question, I guess, uppermost in my mind, and I'm not going to call upon you to answer this because we're more or less out of time, but with these kinds of new generation innovations, we tend to reach tipping points at some point. where a major initiative happens. It could be like in the EU, where the big push to bring in the DSA, DMA, and then the AI Act, et cetera, really galvanizes people to come together. That's on one regional level. It could be in the future that on a global level, there is some kind of tipping point that is not necessarily inspired by technology at all, but by political animosities, conflicts, et cetera, which tend to start being resolved. And then technology starts playing an even bigger picture. And my hope would be that there will be a lot more winners than there are losers. But the pessimistic side of my brain is to say, we're not on that pathway yet. And we are going to have quite a struggle to get there. So I want to thank all of you, all 4 speakers. I hope that maybe some of you will be able to stay around for the second panel, but if not, we will be in touch with you. There will be a summary of this discussion that is produced after the fact, and you will have a chance to have a sight of that. So thank you so much.